Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Joseph Riccio, and we are having a few little technical difficulties. So I am going to make sure that our speaker is here.
Do you see me?
Yes, we can see
Okay.
you, Dan. So give us 1 second while we make sure that Dan can share his screen, and we will be good to go. So Dan, while you get your screen set, I'm just going to do our intro.
Okay.
So, like I said, my name is Cynthia Joseph Riccio. I'm the Associate Director and Director of Visitor Engagement here at the Webdean Stevens Museum. Thank you all for being here today for another episode of Serving Up History. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker, museum guide and educator, Daniel Sterner. Hartford was once a thriving center for retail with several large department stores, including the legendary G. Fox and Company. Dan will talk about the development of the city's major department stores, comparing the different ways they grew from small dry goods outlets into multi-department retail complexes. Dan received a bachelor's degree in history from Wesleyan University and holds a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Chicago and American Studies from Trinity College in Hartford. He has worked as a museum guide for the Webdean Stevens Museum, the Mark Twain House and Museum, and Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. Dan is also the author of 2 books, Vanished Downtown Hartford and A Guide to Historic Hartford, Connecticut. Welcome, Dan.
Can everyone hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So thank you for welcoming me. We're going to talk about department stores in Hartford. And I just need to make sure that I can share let's see. I just have to make sure that I can share my screen. I have to give it the permission. Let's see. There might be a few technical difficulties as I work this out. All right, desktop. Okay. Okay. I just have to put in a code to this is a new computer, so I just have to make sure it is permitted to share here. One moment. Okay. Okay, let's see. All right, let me just start my slideshow. Can everyone see the slideshow? Let's see here.
Yes, I can see it, Dan.
Okay. All right. Does it fill the whole screen? I may need to change a setting.
It is not filling the whole screen.
Okay. Let me make one little change here, and I should be able to. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, so we're all set. Excellent. So I'm going to be talking about historic department stores in downtown Hartford. And if anyone is familiar, I have a YouTube channel called History with Dan Sterner. So you can easily find it if you use my name. And I've done a series of videos about department stores. So what I guess I'm trying to do here is a little bit of collating, bringing together some of the strands from those different videos and sort of doing an overview of the department stores as a group. And this is a really great postcard because it shows, pretty much all the department stores I'll be talking about in one view of Hartford, back in the 30s or 40s when it was really booming as a retail center. And I'll be talking about, roughly the period from, well, really going back well into the 19th century and then right through into the 60s. So I'll talk about G. Fox, which is, of course, the most famous of all the department stores that were in downtown Hartford. It also became the biggest and was, you know, nationally known. And I'll also talk about Brown Thompson, which was right next door. And then a little further down was Sage Allen. And then across the street was Wise Smith department store. And then just a little bit below that, there was actually a branch of Steiger's, although that was I think it was a Springfield department store, but the branch here had some roots in an earlier Hartford store. So that's five different stores, and I'm kind of comparing and contrasting. And my focus here is really on the buildings and the sort of the physical growth as they expanded their footprint and their real estate. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could talk about them. I could go into the great leaders, like Beatrice Fox Feuerbach and G. Fox and others, Isidore Wise at Wise Smith. I could also talk about the insides, I suppose, and how they, changed, merchandise over time. But here the focus is really on the buildings and kind of the more physical aspects of just comparing how they grew in different ways and from their early origins. So to get started, we go way back, back in the 19th century, before there were really any department stores. There were a lot of small stores, and many of them were dry goods stores. There were clothing stores, what were called fancy goods stores. And all of these different stores, there were many competitors. I mean, it was quite a lively environment back in the 19th century. And these are just two examples that I'm showing on the screen here. It actually is interesting because basically these buildings are on either side of the entrance to Pratt Street from Main Street. So we're looking west. On the left is a building that was, on the south corner, and on the right is a building that was on the north corner. And if you could combine these two, you'd be looking right down Pratt Street. And the one on the left is just one example of one of these many dry goods stores called Bliss and Company. And on the right is one called Talcott and Post. And both of these, Bliss, remodeled that building, as the caption says, back in 1867. Talcott and Post was located on the opposite corner, from at least around 1850. So, and these are both stores that relate to the department stores to some extent. So this was sort of the origin, and it would grow from there. And, these were not huge stores, usually they were just one floor. So the upper floors of the building would be for offices or even apartments sometimes, and the stores would grow from there. And G. Fox also started quite small. It went back to 1847. On the left here it's a later picture, but it is imagining the original store of Gerson Fox that was located across the street from where the big G. Fox building is today. And that would have started out as what was called a fancy goods store. So again, just one little store on the first floor of an old gambrel roof building, not unlike the Webb House. And on the right is one of the first stores that also happened to be founded in 1847. So right around the same time as G. Fox. Now we know G. Fox would grow to a huge size. But this store also would grow, and it would grow a lot earlier. It was called the Beehive. And this became one of the biggest stores in Hartford. So almost like a direct ancestor to what we think of as the department store, because it filled, by 1866, this store filled 6 floors of a building on Main Street. And it was, heavily advertised. It was a well-known store. The partners who ran it changed over the years. So in 1866, it was Starr, Burkett, and Ives, but the partners would change. But the store was always known as the Beehive. So, right through, the time of the Civil War and after, this would have been one of the leading stores, actually one of the biggest in the state. Actually, as I said there, largest surface area of any store in the state by 1866. I mean, we would consider it probably pretty small today compared to a modern department store, but for the time, this was quite substantial because they didn't have elevators yet. So to occupy 6 floors, that meant a lot of climbing of stairs. Unfortunately, the Beehive store suffered a tragedy. 1875, the store burned down. So some pretty dramatic pictures here of the destruction of that store. But what's interesting is that it was after that fire that the Cheney building was built. So this is a landmark that survives today. And it was built, partly on the site where the Beehive store had been and several other buildings. And what's interesting is the Cheney building, if you don't know too much about it, it's also called the Richardson building because the architect H.H. Richardson, is a well-known architect. And this was one of his earliest buildings in his distinctive style. But it also it was built, it's called the Cheney building because of the Cheney silk company in Manchester. They were major silk producers. So this was their office building and building, in Hartford. But the first floor was devoted to retail. And right when it opened, the Beehive continued its existence pretty much in the same site where it had been, but now in the new building. So they would have occupied one of the first floor stores on the south corner there. And the Beehive continued right up until actually 1894. And by the time of this trade card here, it was run by William H. Bulkley of the famous Bulkley family, like Morgan Bulkley and Bulkley Bridge and high school and all of that. So he was a wealthy merchant who took over the Beehive and continued it. And the company that he sold out to was Brown Thompson and Company. So if you're looking at the major department stores that I started by mentioning, G. Fox, White Smith, Brown Thompson was really the first to expand and really become a true department store. It was the earliest. And Brown Thompson actually had started back in 1866. So the same year that the Beehive had expanded to 6 floors, Brown Thompson was set up further south on Main Street. But when the Cheney building was built, they moved in. They occupied actually the store on the left. And then in between, another store that would become quite large, Isidore Wise's store, opened in 1890. And he was in the middle of that block. So the Cheney building had, in 1890, it had the Beehive, which had been the biggest store for many years. It had an up-and-coming store by the young Isidore Wise, and it had Brown Thompson, which was on the northern store. And as we know, Brown Thompson would eventually come to occupy this entire building. So I have a section here from a Sanborn Atlas of Hartford, and it shows the Cheney building and all of the parts of it that were added to. I think this is about 1900. All right. So by 1900, Brown Thompson actually took over the entire building. This is showing them on the left. So they were adding additions. Now, the interesting thing is they were quickly expanding. This was a store that was growing. So as I mentioned, they started in 1866, further south on Main Street. A few years later, they expanded that store. Then they moved into the brand new Cheney building. And then they, occupied only one portion of it. So they needed more space. So where did they expand? Now, in their case, they shared the building with other businesses. And as we'll see, G. Fox was just to the north. So they expanded by going to the rear. And I have the dates on here of the dates that they expanded in the rear. So 1884, they built an addition there, and 1890, they expanded out to Kinsley Street, just to the north. And then 1894, that's the year that they bought out the Beehive store. And so they built a connector to their 1890 addition to the Beehive store on the corner. So they ended up occupying this whole area. And so they expanded within the building and behind the building. And they were doing all of this in the 1880s and 90s. So that is how they were able to expand early on. Now, I mentioned G. Fox was just to the north. Now, G. Fox was able to expand right along Main Street. They didn't have to go to the rear of their store because they could actually just go north along the block. So what I mean is they had their first building. So as I mentioned, the store G. Fox started in 1847 as a small fancy goods store, but by 1881, they built their own building just north of the Cheney building. It had 4 floors, as you could see on the left here. And now they still only occupied, the first floor, the basement. Maybe they later moved to the second floor, and the upper floors were offices. So it was still just a little bit before elevators and the store. It was usually accepted that the store would just be, 1 or 2 floors, maybe the basement, and then the rest of the building would be devoted to rentals. Eventually, they would grow to occupy the whole building, and then they would install elevators to make that easier for their customers. But before they filled the upper floors, they wanted to expand, and so they took over the adjacent buildings right along the street. So the first one they took over was called the Averill Building, just to the north. So by the time of this atlas here, you could see G. Fox covers the Averill Building, and then a little bit later, they took over the building north of that. So you can see the expansion here. So there's the original G. Fox building, just north of the Cheney building. And then between 1891 and 1902, they had occupied the building just to the north. They eventually had to wait for leases of the existing tenants to run out. But eventually they were able to take over all of those stores. I just want to point out one of those stores. You can see the sign here. It's G.O. Sawyer Dry Goods Store. I'll be mentioning him again in just a moment, so just keep him in mind. But they expanded even further a few years later. So their next step was to add a floor to their original building in 1910. And then, as I mentioned, 1913, take over the next building north. So by 1913, this was G. Fox. And this is a pattern that you see where these stores occupy many buildings lined up. They have a common storefront all along the first floor, but it's different buildings kind of strung together. And then they might, do additions in the back, or they might build upwards like in 1910. So that's the extent that G. Fox had reached by, the 19 teens. But as some of you may know, there was an epic fire in 1917, which devastated their entire building. So it was destroyed, and it was kind of an amazing story. And I talk about this in my videos about G. Fox, but they basically had to rebuild almost really from scratch. I mean, they had a storage building, in the back, so they could use that, but they had to occupy temporary space, and they even built some things in other parts of downtown to temporarily keep selling and keep their business going. And there's an amazing story that their records were all destroyed, but their loyal customers still came in and paid what they remembered they had owed, even though there was no longer any record to say that they owed anything to the store. So they had very loyal customers, and they persevered. And as we know, they ended up constructing the G. Fox building that we know today, which opened in 1918. So this is quite an expansion from what they had before, because now they're occupying, an 11-story building, very grand. So they're not going to need to worry about expanding and building additions for a while, because, right there in 1918, they built something much bigger than what any other store in the city had. So in a way, the fire kind of eased the way to building something bigger right away. We'll see how other stores expanded as well in comparison. So let's talk about some of those other stores. So this is I mentioned this at the start of this talk. This is the building that was right on the corner of Pratt Street. So we're looking down Pratt. You can see Society for Savings a little bit, which is still there, a little bit further down Pratt Street. But on that corner, which is now a parking lot, but at this point, I had mentioned it was a dry goods store owned by Bliss and Company. But that was eventually taken over by a store called Cook and Hills. Now, that's not one of the department stores like G. Fox or even Wise Smith that you might have heard of, because it didn't, continue under that name. But it grew like the other stores. 1886, it started as just a single store, taking over an earlier dry goods store there. And by 1891, it had expanded all the way to the corner. So just in a similar way, but on a little bit smaller scale, but similar to what we saw with G. Fox before the fire, they were basically just buying buildings and expanding along Main Street until they had a store that went all along many feet. Now, here's what it looked like a little bit later. Now it was called Cook and Hills, but then Cook retired. So from 1896 to 1919, it continued as C.S. Hills and Company. And this was, a full-on department store. And you could see how even though it's three different buildings, they put a common signage. So it had it looked like one store. And the reason you've never heard of Cook and Hills or C.S. Hills is because when Hills retired in 1919, that was basically the end of it, except that he had a partner named E.V. Vedder, and E.V. Vedder's son, E.V. Vedder Jr., partnered with the Steiger family up in Massachusetts, and they decided to erect a new store. So this building was erected in stages, 1919 to 1921, and the store was originally called Steiger Vedder because it was Vedder's son and Steiger's son who actually ran it. But Vedder quickly retired himself. He went off to other things, and so it just became a branch of the Steiger's chain, and obviously a lot smaller than G. Fox and some of the other department stores. But it did exist until 1962. That store continued. And it turns out one of the reasons it never expanded beyond this was because of some property issues. I mentioned it was three buildings, right, that the store had occupied. Well, even though they built this big building, it still had three different property owners owning sections of it. So apparently this really hindered the growth of the store in terms of just modernizing it. And eventually, I guess the Steigers chain just felt it wasn't worth continuing in Hartford since they couldn't really expand the store. And then the building survived, I think, until the 1980s, and that's why there's a parking lot, because it was torn down. So that was more of a short-lived store. But there were some other stores that expanded even earlier. Let's go back about 20 years. So around 1900, G. Fox was expanding. Brown Thompson had pretty much added all those rear additions. But in the process of the expansion of those stores, they had displaced some of the smaller shop owners. So I mentioned way back when G. Fox was taking over the building just to the north, there was a man named George O. Sawyer there who had a dry goods store. And then in Brown Thompson's case, it was Isidore Wise, whose store was in the Brown Thompson building, and he had to move out when they took over the whole building. Well, both of these store owners around 1897 decided to build their own buildings. And what was different about these compared to the earlier buildings is that they would have a store that would be on every floor. They would have elevators. They would have all the things that we think of as a department store having, even a restaurant inside and stuff like that. So you could see here on the left, that is the building that was at the corner of Asylum and Main. So again, it's the parking lot today, but later that is where what's considered to be Hartford's earliest skyscraper was built, that was later torn down. But this building was built for George O. Sawyer's Dry Goods Company, but it was really a department store because he occupied that entire building in 1897. And that same year, Isidore Wise opened his building, which also, had elevators and occupied the whole building. So these were both very ambitious stores. Now, they had different fates because Sawyer was bankrupt within, 2.5 years. So 1900, he was done. And this building that we see in the picture on the left was torn down, not long after. Wise Smith, on the other hand, would prosper. And by 1901, as you could see, he had also taken over an adjacent building, the old Roberts Block, which had the old Hartford Opera House in the rear of it. He took over. So he was expanding rapidly. So he had what is that, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think he had a 6 or 7-story building there. And then he took over additional space next door. He did have trouble with that opera house because even after he acquired the Roberts building, the opera house in the back continued to have a lease. And so it was actually quite a number of years before he could finally oust the opera house. So for many years, his continuous storefront along Main Street was interrupted because there had to be, as you could see there, an entrance to the opera house right in the middle. But eventually he got to take over that as well. So right around the same time as these other two, of course, that's when Sage Allen. Now, Sage Allen started in 1889. I had showed at the beginning of the video the Talcott and Post dry goods store that was on the north corner of Main and Pratt Street. And that's a store that was then rented by Sage Allen and Company. And by 1898, they were ready to erect their own building across the street. Unlike these two stores on the left, though, they only occupied the first floor and the basement initially. So they were still following a more traditional model of not, going all in on elevators and having multiple floors. So it would take a while till they got to that point. So Sage Allen. So these stores then by 1900, you had Wise Smith and Sage Allen were very firmly established and on their way to really being full-fledged department stores. But the way that they would expand their stores, varied based on the circumstances. So in this picture on the right, you can see the way that Isidore Wise of Wise Smith expanded his store. Basically, the store on the left occupies the area that I have a square there. So basically, he was able to get additional land just to the south, and he was able to raise his store by 3 additional stories. So from that original base in 1912, he expanded. So you could see his process. So first he takes over the building just to the north, although he has to eventually wait until he can oust the opera house before he can fully occupy that building. And then also he takes over the building just to his south, which he's able to demolish and then expand his basic building. And then in the years after that, in the early 20s, he's focused a lot of his attention on his rear, which actually connected up with Pratt Street. So this is a view down Pratt Street. And by the mid-1920s, Wise Smith and Company owned a lot of the buildings on the north side of Pratt Street. In fact, this one, and most of these buildings are still there, this one here was actually an entrance to Wise Smith. So you could enter the store from Pratt Street, even though the main front was on Main Street. So he had a lot of additions in the back, but he also had an idea of Pratt Street that he wanted to keep it, with a feel of smaller retail, which, it still retains today. So actually Isidore Wise was responsible in a lot of ways for maintaining the character of Pratt Street. Even though it connected to his big store, he rented out the other stores to different smaller businesses. And his expansion was still not done. At the end of the 1920s, he finally demolished that Roberts building. So on the picture on the right, you could see that the Roberts building that had the opera house was still there. But in the picture on the left, he's demolished it and built an even grander building. And then the final stage in 1930 was to join his earlier building, to make it match architecturally. So you could see by the time his project was finished, he had a large building and a unified facade. So it's kind of it's interesting. It contrasts a lot with what we saw with G. Fox, right? Because G. Fox, had all these strung out buildings basically, and then there was a big fire, so they could start from scratch and just build a gigantic building. Wise, on the other hand, did it sort of piecemeal. He took over adjacent buildings, gradually expanded, and then finally he had, the property where he could build a much larger building. So it's just kind of a comparable but different process, but basically doing the same kind of thing. Now, so that brings us to about 1930. Now, around the same time that Wise was expanding his store to its full size, that was when G. Fox was doing its big expansion and modernization, or one of its many expansions. So from 1928 to 1934, so they still had the building, but they expanded some of the floors in the back of the building. They expanded their service building just to the north, and the bridge, which is still there, the historic bridge linking their building to their storage building, was built in 1930. And then it was also during this period that they put the famous marquee along their front. So, and the Art Deco interior that G. Fox would become famous for was put in during these years. So the building was there in 1918, but the interior would have still looked very old-fashioned if we were to go in today. But it was, in these years, and it, remember, this is right around the time the Great Depression is starting. So this was a big project for G. Fox to undertake, but they kept with it, and they did it in stages. That's why it's a range of dates, 1928 to 1934, because they did like one floor one year, then they would do another floor until the whole store had been modernized and all of their additions had been constructed. And I just want to mention, of course, that marquee is where the famous Christmas Village stood for many years every season. I did a whole video about that, about the Christmas Village. It was first set up in 1959, and it lasted a few years. Just a moment. Oof, my voice starts to go. It lasted for a few years, and then for a few years there was no village because the buildings had deteriorated. But then later in the 60s, they built a new village because people liked the village and wanted it back. So there were actually two phases, but this is the original Christmas Village of 1959. And actually the I don't know if you could see my mouse, but the Webb House is one of the buildings there. Okay, now this is one of my favorite pictures of Hartford department stores, because it really shows the situation with all the additions and different things. First of all, on the far left corner, you can actually see the sign for Steiger's there. So that's Steiger's that I mentioned earlier. And then right across the street from it is Sage Allen. So I talked about the way that Wise Smith had grown by taking over adjacent buildings, and then by 1930 building a massive store. Sage Allen had issues, though. They couldn't really do that. They were hemmed in because, as you could see, to the north there was the Cone Jewelers store, which they couldn't, they didn't purchase that until I think 1951. So there was this store just stuck there that they couldn't take over. And then just to the south there was the Ballerstein millinery building. So they had basically two buildings to the right and left that they weren't going to take over. So their only option was to expand, as Brown Thompson had done earlier, to expand to the rear and the sides. So I have here their first expansion. They had to basically skip the Cone building and build on the corner. So this was their addition of 1905 for Sage Allen. And then, the next edition, 1911, was just a little bit further down Kinsley Street to the rear, and it all joined up with their main building in the back. So they basically had a U shape around the Cone building. And then in the late 20s, at the same period that Wise Smith was building its big building, and the same period that G. Fox was doing its big modernization, Sage Allen was building its final major rear addition, which covered the entire block, between Kinsley and Temple Street there. So a little more ramshackle and strung out. They weren't able to build that unified facade that some of their rivals did. Yeah, and as I mentioned, 1951 is when they finally got control of the Cone building. But by that point, they weren't going to necessarily build a brand new building or anything big, at least yet. So that's Sage Allen. Now, Brown Thompson also wanted to expand, and they had expanded by, I mentioned that they had rear additions, right? And their earliest rear addition was in the 1880s. Well, they replaced that in 1917 with a very tall annex. So actually, it's not as tall as G. Fox, but it's actually taller than Sage Allen, it looks like. So, but you might sense the problem here, because if G. Fox ever wanted to expand, it had this Brown Thompson addition behind it because it overlaps the two buildings, and that would become a problem. So just to illustrate some of the Brown Thompson growth, the picture on the left is a rear. So we're basically standing behind the store. We're on Market Street or near Market Street, looking west towards the rear of Brown Thompson. So straight ahead is that original rear addition of 1884, and then they extended it in 1890. And in the foreground, they were actually in 1911 excavating to build an automobile building, because I don't think any of the others sold cars, but that's one of the things that Brown Thompson did. They actually sold automobiles, and they had a garage, they had a car sales room, and on the right you can see that building. So that was 1911, and then 1917 they replaced the 1884 edition with that tall building that I showed earlier. So so that was their expansion during the early 20th century. So here's another Sanborn atlas. I think here we're looking at probably 1922. So you can see that rear addition of 1917. So just above it is their 1911 garage. And then they had an earlier garage just to the right of that. So all of that is to the rear, but you could clearly see that they were right behind G. Fox. So jump forward to the late 30s, G. Fox wants to expand. They finally, maxed out their building, and they want to build an addition to the rear, but the Brown Thompson annex is in their way. So what they're going to do, well, first of all, they purchase the Cheney building, the Brown Thompson real estate they purchase. So the Brown Thompson store continues to exist, but the actual building is owned by G. Fox. So they have control over the property, and that gives them the ability to move the 1917 Brown Thompson edition, basically demolish what's directly behind Brown Thompson, and then through a massive engineering feat, move the addition of 1917 from behind G. Fox to be behind Brown Thompson. And you can see a picture of the moving taking place. I mean, to move it, that whole length was quite an undertaking. And they used these donkey engines like the one on the left to power it. And they built a whole framework, and they basically just slowly slid the building down. And, in 1937, this was a major engineering feat. And the amazing thing, too, is using power cables and everything, the store continued in operation. So people were still going in that store. So it must have been moving very slowly, but, it went that full distance. And so today, that building still exists. And now it's at the rear of the Cheney building. And you can still see it there, excuse me, today. So once that building was shoved out of the way, that enabled G. Fox to finally build their addition of 1938. So again, we're looking at that rear view, looking up towards Main Street at the construction of the G. Fox addition. And for a while, that Brown Thompson auto building was still there, but G. Fox now had the room to add to the rear. So here's what the completed, after the 1938 edition, what it looked like. So you had an enlarged storage building down below, and you had an enlarged G. Fox building as well. So So this was a store that was booming. And as we know, in these years, during its heyday, getting into the 50s and 60s, this was the largest privately owned department store in the country. So I mean, this was a major store, and it had expanded. The other stores pretty much by 1938, they were not expanding anymore. It was G. Fox was the one that still had expansion to do. So it had dominated. And then in this picture, so we're looking from Market Street, up towards Main. And there's the rear, and the arrow is pointing to the final addition to G. Fox, which was 1960. So even by the late 50s, early 60s, G. Fox was still growing, and they added that, and they also had a parking garage which they expanded on Market Street, and then their service building was vastly expanded. So they were still growing right into the early 60s. It was actually shortly after that Beatrice Fox Auerbach finally sold the store to a conglomerate. So what happened to the other stores? Well, Sage Allen did eventually demolish the Cone building. And this is really kind of the final major change to the downtown department stores. Now we're into the late 60s, and they demolished the Cone building. Now, in the case of, say, Wise Smith, he was able to create a beautiful unified facade. He was really focused on the aesthetics. But by the late 60s, when Sage Allen finally, was creating more of a unified facade, stylistically, it had some issues. It was, as you can see on the right, it was basically just a big, slab with the name Sage Allen on it, covering over part of the original architecture of their 1898 buildings. So aesthetically, it did the job. They finally had, a united, kind of facade. But obviously, the styles of the early and mid 20th century were in the past. So yeah, you could see that facade, and well, they did decorate it for Christmas, I guess. And as for Wise Smith, well, that store was closed in 1954. I mean, I Wise Smith is not as well known today, as G. Fox or Sage Allen or even Brown Thompson, because it didn't last as long. I mean, it was already out by the early 50s, and I think more people today remember when it was a Corvettes. After Wise Smith closed, Corvettes took over. So from 57 to 71, it was an EJ Corvettes store, a branch of a chain that was more of a discount department store. But the building is still there. It's gone through changes. Parts of it were covered up. Then they, restored it to show some of the original design. And it was, for a while, it was the American Airlines building. Now it's got apartments in it, but it's still there today. And of course, Brown Thompson, now they, as I mentioned, their real estate was acquired by G. Fox, but the store itself continued right into the late 60s. So Brown Thompson, but then eventually G. Fox just took over the whole store. So after a while, it got to the point where, that store was more, it was just like a name that people remember. There was even a restaurant in the building called Brown Thompson, but the sign is still there. So we still remember Brown Thompson. And of course, Sage Allen. So Sage Allen closed, I think it was 1990. And luckily, the building's facade survived. All the ugly stuff that was added on in the late 60s was removed, and the areas, to the north and south of it, were built out, but definitely in a way that highlights the original building, and it's now an apartment building as well. And the clock is still out front, which kind of gives you a little bit of the history for Sage Allen, at least, because originally it was the clock outside of the Henry Cohn jewelry store. And when Sage Allen finally took over that store and added it to their structure, they put their own name on the other side of the clock. So you got the Henry Cohn on one side, and then the Sage Allen on the other, with the going way back to the original date of 1889 when they first started across the street. And then, of course, G. Fox is still there. Now Capital Community College is in there. that store closed in 93. So as far as the history of these stores go, from 1847, it was one of the first of the early stores that would become, eventually grow. And then it was, really the last of the stores to close, and it became the biggest store. So that's why G Fox is so well remembered today. So what I've done here is just an overview. If you watch my videos, I have one about each and two about G Fox. Well, actually three. So about just G Fox alone, but I also have videos about Sage Allen, one about Wise Smith, and one about Brown Thompson, and then one that also covers the block where that Steigers had been as well. So, and also you can check out my website, historicbuildingsct.com. I put up the link there for the link tree because that has links to all my other social media and whatever. And you can find my books either on Amazon or other online retailers. There's a guide to historic Hartford, Connecticut, and vanished downtown Hartford. And then, of course, the YouTube channel called History with Dan Sterner. If you come to my channel, you can watch my videos, leave a comment if you want to share your memories of any of these stores or anything else that I talk about. You can subscribe to the channel. So hopefully we can continue to grow that. All right, so let's see.
So I do have a few questions, Dan, and
Yes.
thank you for that presentation.
Okay.
I had a comment that said wonderful presentation, so wanted to pass that along to you. The first question, where is some of the fashion house that may have been left in some of the buildings? Do you have any idea?
What you mean, like the
Like any of the clothing or anything that may
clothing?
have
Ooh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, presumably they would have sold off their, they probably had like sales to get rid of everything. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I mean, I know a lot of stuff, like the Connecticut Historical Society has a lot of the well, photographs and memorabilia, and maybe some of the merchandise, so there is a collection there. Some of the other stores, I bet, like Wise Smith, I can't imagine, I mean, probably that was just sold off at the time and then it was remodeled to be another store. So some of these stores, the stuff's probably long gone. I mean, I also do a video about the Lord and Taylor branch that was in West Hartford. And there was a big article, when that store finally closed down, how they had a sale and like everything must go. So I don't know how much survives in that way.
Well, thank you. Where was the customer base for all of these stores coming from at the turn of the century? Certainly not just from Hartford. Did they come via trolley, railways,
I
and
think they
then
did.
eventually autos?
Yeah, I mean, I think they did. Well, certainly G Fox was a regional thing, and they had deliveries. I mean, they did deliveries to towns all over the greater Hartford area. So, their delivery trucks, I mean, they had quite a reach just beyond Hartford. And there's that whole story about, oh, did Beatrice Fox Auerbach try to, affect the highways and stuff like that. I don't know all the details there, but certainly they had a wide reach. And I think, Hartford was a regional shopping destination for
Mhm.
sure.
When did Gershon Fox die? When did he no longer run the business?
Well, it was basically, it was three generations. Gerson Fox, I think he started with his brother, actually, maybe several brothers, but he died, I think, 1880 or 81. So right at the point when G Fox was building its own building. So he died right when that was built. And then his son Moses Fox took over. So Moses Fox was in charge during that whole period, particularly that tough period when the fire destroyed everything and they had to totally rebuild. And the stories at the times, he would say, well, he was urged by his friend, well, you're too old, you can't start over from scratch, but he was determined to do it. And then he would have passed away in the late 30s, right when they were doing their massive edition of 1938. So I think he died just before that was finished. So it's interesting. They both died just before big things were being built. And then, of course, it was the granddaughter of Gerson Fox, who then, Beatrice, who ran, right up until the 60s when she sold it. And apparently at that time, I guess it was just not feasible for one family to hold on to such a big operation. Now, the other, some of these stores were run by these individuals for very long periods of time. This Norman F. Allen, who ran Sage Allen for decades and decades. And of course, Isidore Wise. I mean, he started his store, back in the 1880s, when he was in his early 20s, and people were saying, oh, you can't do that. He was someone who always defied expectation. He bought the store that was in the Brown Thompson, later the Brown Thompson building. He bought a store there, and people told him, no, it's too big, you can't succeed against the Beehive, which was the big store. And he said, no, I'm going to do it. And then when he built his first building in 1897 across the street, it's like, oh no, that having a multi-story building with elevators, people aren't going to do that, and so, and then he ran the thing right up until, the late 40s when he retired. So, we're talking about a career well over a half century. Interesting.
Wow. We'll take two more quick questions.
Okay.
And somebody that you know very well, Dick Agnew, wants to know, are the marble pillars still intact in the old G. Fox building?
That's a good question. I mean, I haven't been inside recently, so I'm assuming they must have, if that's a big structural feature, there must be some of that still there. But I guess, yeah, I mean, it's a community college, so presumably you can go in and check that out. I'll have to take a look. I mean, I know probably a lot was lost, but I hope they're still there.
And one more question. First, a comment, wonderful presentation. And do you know what happened to the last Christmas village?
That's a good question. I mean, I heard stories that they still, because it was made in Wethersfield. It was by the Oldham Studios, and I don't know if they still have any of it in storage. I guess the original one, just deteriorated and was destroyed. But the second one, there might be parts that survive, but I don't know if Oldham Studios has it or if somebody else does. Yeah, that would be it. They could bring that back. Why not? Right? They still have the marquee. Or make a new village, wouldn't that be a good project for students at a community college? I don't know what kind of arts programs they have, but to construct a village to put up, I don't know.
Well, Dan, on behalf of the museum and the NSCDA CT, thank you for joining us today. And if you enjoyed this program, please consider donating to the Webb Dean Stevens Museum at wdsmuseum.org. to help us continue to offer free and affordable community events. Join us for the next Serving Up History, Women in War on March 9th, presented by Louisa Iacursi, Interim Education Director at the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. Thank you all again for being here. And Dan, thank you again for your wonderful presentation.
Thanks. Thank you very much.